So I believe our rock stars need not much introduction. They are well known, and so we will try to stick to some entertaining, engaging, and relevant content. We have in this audience leaders in the education community who are committed to making a difference in education and in the lives of humans and our society. We have for-profits, we have nonprofits, we have investors, and leaders of education institutions, not only around the country, but around the globe. So, you know, and everyone has been attending this conference for years, but everyone has been at it for a long time. So it begs the question, why are we still here to make sense of it all? I'd like to maybe address some of the barriers to progress. What are the levers that we could collectively pull that would accelerate some of this transformation? Maybe pose a question. If we were given a timeline to make positive change in the next 1,000 days, what would we do? And I think the answer is self-evident, but who is responsible? Is it industry? Is it academia? Is it government? Or is it all of the above? So this unique opportunity is to get the perspectives from a former top policymaker, from a leader of one of the world's leading research academic institutions, and from the chief executive of the world's largest private education company. So I guess just a very quick sort of level set for context. For a very diverse audience, I'd like for everyone on our panel to just maybe spend a minute and say, from your perspective, meaning a leader in your respective industries, what do you do well and what do you do poorly?
In the public sector, and I speak for the public sector today, I think the leaders, the elected leaders, the CEOs of a public charity, we all do the decision-making well, especially in education. There isn't a governor or a senator or a president ever in the history of this country who hadn't said, I love education, I'm for education. And we all have an education initiative that we plug and we fund and we start. And we're so excited about what's going to happen to real people in your state or your country. And then, after all that's done, you walk away to the next set of issues, Brad, and you leave it to the bureaucracy to implement the whole initiative. One of the first things I learned in public service, because something I did was pretty badly screwed after it was trying to be implemented. And I went over and asked the Department of Education, what is going on? And this woman had the audacity to say to me, you don't know the difference between a you be and a we be. You be gone in 4 years, we be here forever. So we do what we want to do. That's what we do poorly.
Right.
It's true. I'd be gone.
But you're here now, which we appreciate. I taught at Stanford for about 30 years, and I noticed out front we are number 2. So we try harder in academia and at our institution. I think across the board, we're good at thinking. That's what we do as academics. If you want someone to sit in a dark corner and think hard about something for a few months or a few years or a few decades, you know, go to a university and you'll find somebody who can do that. So we pride ourselves on being deep thinkers. We also get kind of narrow because we all try to distinguish ourselves individually from our peers and academic competitors, but we're good at deep thoughts. Another thing that I discovered on the other side of it when I took on a leadership role about 6 years ago is we're not very good at institutional change. We as academics are really big on being forward-thinking and adaptive in our academic fields, but the structure of the university, the structure of most educational institutions is a really complicated kind of equilibrium point in which we really don't know how to change any of the factors that are involved. The synergy between teaching and research, the way that someone's salary is cobbled together from different places, the combination of internal and external academic community rewards, those are all, they've evolved to a point in which we understand how to go forward in the way that we've been before, but we really don't understand institutional or sector-wide or dramatic change at all.
Okay. Thank you. So, Brad, you asked us to be candid.
Please.
And you asked us to be industry-wide rather than company-specific. Important point in bearing in mind what I was going to say. Secondly, in the spirit of this event, allow me to rephrase the second half of your question. So rather than what do we do poorly, what can we learn and what can we do better? What do we do well? Well, just look around this room. Look at the passion, look at the talent, look at the overwhelming sense of purpose of people who are dedicating their lives to how we can deploy technology to personalize and adapt education to empower and transform the life chances of millions of people who've not had the opportunities in life that we've had. And look at the innovation, the investment, and the commitment to disrupt and to change. All that is absolutely fantastic. But on what could we learn and what could we do better, those qualities that enable you to do all those things don't naturally lend themselves to an ability perhaps to doubt or to stop and pause or reflect or to question. But I think that's something that's fundamentally important that we do, and that we challenge ourselves and hold ourselves to account to say, is our sense of purpose and ambition being matched by the outcomes that we actually deliver? As you know, I mean, the governor was at the event 5 years ago when we launched it. Pearson as a company have really tried to embed this whole idea of efficacy and outcomes into everything that we do. We reached a milestone last week with the first publication of our 17 externally audited reports. There's some really helpful insights, but there's no silver bullets, there's no easy, simple messages or headlines. What I think there has to be is this commitment from all of us, perhaps, to trust ourselves and trust each other, to be more open, more transparent, to learn and share what we find out as we make all these changes, partly because I think that's how we can then work more effectively with academia, education sector, with the public sector. Secondly, I think we'll win more support as profit-making organizations, that for-profit companies can be a fundamental force for good. But most importantly, I think it's the way we'll actually get a better return on the investments that we're making, because I gain greater confidence from all the work we're doing in efficacy from knowing that it's much more likely that the $1 billion a year that we're spending on the research and development of new products and services, we're learning, not guessing, as we make that investment. So I think combining the fantastic sense of purpose with a greater emphasis on outcomes and accountability is what we do well and what we could do better.
Yeah, and kudos to you and your organization for taking that progressive move, making that data transparent, the good and the what could be improved. Something that could probably be a learning lesson applied to many institutions that would bring about progress. So a slightly tougher question. So our economy is advancing rapidly. Some have called it the fourth industrial age, and in regards to technology, the second machine age. So what needs to happen to accommodate the modern learner in the context of this modern economy And again, from each of your perspectives, you know,
You mean to
John?
go first? Yeah, so I mean, I think this whole debate was kick-started, wasn't it, about 5 years ago with that report, that the headline of which was that, 47% of all jobs in America were going to disappear to robots within 20 years. As a result of that, we commissioned a major piece of research with one of the co-authors of that report, Professor Mike Osborne, who's the Professor of Machine Learning at Oxford University, working with leading experts in the field, and we arrived at a much more nuanced and I think helpful and much more actionable report. It's online. I won't go into the details of it now. The big lessons I would take from it are, first of all, we should be digital optimists. At every stage of industrial change, go right back to the days of the Luddites and the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. It's much easier to imagine and conceive of the jobs that will be lost and the jobs that will be created by technological change. So first of all, I think that let's be optimistic. Second, you cannot look at technological change in isolation from other big factors. Globalization. Look at the huge influx of Chinese pioneers and innovators here this week. Globalization, income inequality, urbanization. All these factors shape it. Third, it's not human or machine is a false dichotomy. It's about human and machine. It always has been and it always will be. And fifth, here's another false dichotomy. It's not knowledge or skills, it's knowledge and skills. People still need to know important things about the world in which they live, but they also need skills that perhaps previously we considered were the preserve of a liberal arts elite. Everybody now needs fluency of ideas, the ability to synthesize complex information, to problem solve, to persuade others of a point of view, to teach, to learn, to empathize, these things that make us uniquely human. And our challenge and task is deploying the power of technology to democratize that, to make that available to everybody and not expect them to come to us, but for us to break free of the constraints of physical campus and the like and actually get to where people are, because we're going to need to reskill, retrain, re-engineer, relearn, all of us throughout our professional and working lives.
Mm-hmm.
So as a computer scientist, I'm going to be a digital optimist. And an educator, I think that changing demand, changing interests is really an opportunity. So I see, first of all, that the projection or the thought that jobs and the way we live will change is really an opportunity for all of us to rethink what we're teaching. And when we rethink what we're teaching, that's a really good time to think about how we're teaching. So this plays into changing awareness and sophistication about pedagogy and applying new tools, digital tools and any tools of any kind to improve what we do. So I think there's a great deal of opportunity for us as educators to take the greater need for people across greater ranges of their lives and see that as a time that we can really reinvent what we're doing in a meaningful way. If there wasn't an interest in changing what people learn, we would have less motivation, less interest, less opportunity that way. And then the final point, I think, is that this second machine age, fourth industrial revolution, that's going to affect us also. And so we are not entirely disjoint and separated from the changing use of technology in the world and the way that people address information and process and learn with it. So we ought to think of adopting some of the trends that we see in broader areas in the way that we think about doing our jobs as educators.
Yeah, thank you. And piggybacking on your perspective related to technology, most know about Moore's Law. There is no Moore's Law equivalent for humans, and there's definitely no Moore's Law related to policy. So Bev, I invite you to answer this question with regards to both policy and your now current chapter in life or in business and how you see that.
I'm thinking about the comments. John, I'm a digital optimist too. The work I do personalized learning is phenomenal across the country. And with you, John, I respect the work you do so much. I understand the comments have been made, what we learn and how we learn. From my perspective, the thing that keeps me up at night, and I hope some of you all are thinking about it, is who will be doing the learning and why the learning must take place. I'm out there, many of you are out there in communities and cities across the country, and I see real people who work hard, who go home and put food on a table and are working 2 or 3 jobs, or who just are so focused on their own lives and their families' lives. They don't have a clue what's coming down the chute. We go to all these meetings all over the world and we hear the same thing. 50, 60% of the jobs are going to be gone in the service industry. I look at real people walking down the street and I think your job's gone in 4 years. Do you have a clue what's about to happen to you and your family, to your mortgage payment and your car payment, and the chance for education for your kids? I think the most important, critical imperative in the country is for somebody to stand up, a leader, a group like you all, GSV, ASU, somebody to stand up and send the message out to the people, not to be afraid of what's going to happen, but at least for folks to understand that this is the first time in my life that there's ever been an imperative for adult learners to go back to the idea of learning and changing and retooling and innovating themselves. We can handle, I think, very well the younger people, and we can handle those now in initiatives for career or college training. I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about the 35-year-old, the 45-year-old, and yeah, the 55 and 65-year-old in this economy who needs to work and wants to work because it makes them better and happier, and they don't know. And I think it's our responsibility as thought leaders to at least work on putting that message out there in real people's English so real people can understand that their life could very well be at risk unless they're prepared to change.
So we've covered some of the challenges. We've shared some insights. Clearly, these are all very complex issues that are shared amongst a number of very entrenched stakeholders. So in the frame of progress, how do we collaborate across public sector, private sector, academia, startup, innovation, in order to make real change, not just talk about it, but to do it and to make it stick?
Okay. I think this is a lot about, I think that colleagues here have talked a lot about the culture change, and your point about, digital change being exponential and human change being linear. I was at an event with 100 CEOs of, incumbents like Pearson, many of them many times bigger, who were leading their own digital disruption and transformation. And you ask 100 different CEOs what was the biggest single challenge they faced. Every single one of them said was the organization and cultural changes that they need to make inside their own organizations. And I think we all feel that in how we lead it and how we work with our partners and others to achieve it. And I was talking to somebody recently about this, and they made the point that hadn't occurred to me in quite these terms before, is if you make change far, distant, and vague, it's not surprising that people are frightened by it and disengage from it. If you can make change small, immediate, and specific, then you can engage people. So back to that debate about the future of work. If we say to college professors, instructors, teachers, that you need to prepare young people for jobs that don't exist in industries that haven't yet been created, what do they do with that in practical terms? Is it any surprise that they say, well, I'm going to carry on teaching my same courses in my same ways because that just all sounds too scary, too frightening, too intimidating to me? So I think this is quite a high-level answer, but my experience, whether it's working with our partners at Arizona State University and trying to expand their online program, whether it's working with Save the Children in the refugee camps in Jordan, or whether it's working with ministries of education around the world, the more immediate, specific, and actionable you can make it, the more we can help to make progress. And I think that's a sort of important lesson. That takes me back to this point about data, outcomes, learning, sharing, creating a learning ecosystem which is mutual and reciprocal, where we can all learn from and share with each other.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important.
And if I could just sort of throw it back at you, that's what needs to be done. How could academia support you? How could policy and or startup companies support you in that?
Well, I mean, I think by very much, as I say, working with, engaging with each other, being very open, being very transparent, by understanding our respective strengths, by sort of respecting each other's roles and intellectual property, but also having trust, perhaps to show, back to that point about showing some doubt, showing some vulnerability, be willing to say, well, this didn't quite work, but this is what we learned. That's what the best teachers do every day in the classroom, and that's the sort of behavior that I think we have to replicate in terms of the sort of more sustainable, trusting relationships that we need to build with each other and with our partners.
Yeah.
I mean, two ways you can try to move forward are grand challenges. I think we need some process for issuing the grand challenge. Somebody, some organization, some mechanism needs to put that forward. But a grand challenge that we all, or this half of the room got really behind, that would really change things. And another process really that's always effective is a pilot. Although pilots, you then have some challenges around the successful pilot trying to scale that up. And so I think those are two ways we could work together. And we could think about that as we walk off the stage, if not before that. One thing that occurs to me in thinking about what educational infrastructure, mostly I'm interested in higher education, but the same principles may appear otherwise, is we spend a lot of time competing with each other as institutions. And some of that effort is probably constructive. It helps us think about how to be successful and to, in some sense, competition can cause people to work harder and think about where there are specific opportunities and innovations. But there's 4,000 colleges and universities or more in the US and many, many more worldwide. And so some kind of partnerships among them seems like a pretty obvious thing to do. So if we had a grand challenge, some recognition of where we wanted to go, and some framework for us to get together, I would think from my perspective, at a Ivy League style institution, if we were to get together with a couple of large public research universities, a couple of community colleges, a couple of liberal arts four-year teaching colleges, a range of institutions, and take on a grand challenge together and then compete with another such team. I think that's a much more exciting sort of scenario than 4,000 food fights going on.
Exactly.
We all like a food fight, John. I love this conversation that we're having about collaboration and about how do you actually force the public sector into the formula. For years, you've had these great companies and you've had these marvelous institutions willing to do marvelous work with the public sector, but we in the public sector have been reluctant or hesitant. And I think that has to change. Last week, the NAEP scores just came out on America's kids, 4th and 8th grade. And if any of you read them and dug into them, you can see that America's flat. We're going backwards, so to speak. And children in disadvantaged neighborhoods or in disadvantaged families are falling further and further behind. Now, we know that the only way to attack the problem and the challenges for that specific community is using great academicians and great technology from the private sector. And so, again, to plug perhaps North Carolina, in North Carolina we did just that. We had a real problem with reading in K through 3. And we did an initiative called Read to Achieve, where I went out on a limb and hired a technology company. It was the first time in the history that we'd ever done that in the state, many for the first time in the country. And we spent millions and millions of dollars on this chance, this risk to teach kids to read. Now, it was high risk for me, but high reward for the folks in my state. It was really high risk for the business, because everybody everywhere was watching to see if they could succeed or if they'd fail. And it was high risk for the universities that we brought into the equation, because we knew at the end of the day we couldn't let Johnny get up and read to 1 million people. So we had to have the data, the real data, the in-time data. It worked in North Carolina. Democrats and Republican administrations have bought into it. It's gone on for now 11 years. So for me, that was the first instance where I sat back and realized the public sector, even folks who've been in the Department of Education for 30 years, can't do this work. We don't have the expertise. The states don't have the expertise. You need to bring in companies and business leaders, people like you all, with the ideas and innovations to address real problems in real time in communities across the country. And then you've got to have the academic support, the great thinkers and the great data producers to show us if what we're doing. So we too have efficacy in the work being done in the public sector. Most of the time, you pay your tax dollars and all you can see is the junk on the road. You don't think they're being well spent. Maybe it's time somebody challenged the public sector to do efficacy.
Thank you, Governor. So far we've covered some context. We've outlined what we think are some of the grand challenges, some insights and proposed solutions, including collaboration across important stakeholders. And so, lastly, I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts on the important yet elusive question of scale. I'm reminded of a William Gibson quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." So the assumption I'd like everyone to agree with me on, just for the sake of this point, is that we already know so much about what is working properly and what is not, to some degree, but just let's agree for the sake of this conversation. How do we simply take what we know and scale it?
I'll start. Again, from the field, from the level playing field. We all know that the advent of digital learning and the availability of technology and connectivity and devices and computers in the homes are critical in America and around the world. You go to Africa and you see these communities who are desperate for connectivity and desperate for the devices, and folks are reaching out to help them. I go into some of the communities in America and wish that the country as a whole would decide we're in the 21st century, we know what's happening with the workforce. Why in the world aren't we being sure that there's connectivity in every nick and cranny of this country? So for me, that's the big thing. Thank you all. I think it's just true. And the second thing for me is make sure every kid has a device. Again, the NAEP scores. The NAEP scores were really lower in the disadvantaged kids' scores. I wonder if it's because it was the first time they took them on a tablet. You know, they perhaps don't have the same practice that many of our children have. So I think connectivity and availability of the devices and the technology will empower people to then work to address this future. Brad, I don't think you can scale it otherwise. I do not believe that in America we can scale this opportunity you're having these two gentlemen talk about until we have access and connection in every home and in every business in the state, all the states and in America.
Scale's a very tricky issue here. My own personal history around this has to do with the creation of the MOOC movement down my hall in the computer science department at Stanford. Several companies and nonprofits and other efforts started from that group of people. And I think what we learned there were two things. One thing that was not as evident to me at the beginning as well into that is the absolutely huge demand for learning. There are people out there anxious and crying for opportunities to learn and improve themselves. The simple idea that we could take our pedagogical model of the lecture course and scale it by putting cameras in lectures and broadcast those, and that would be meaningful learning for everyone, that was extremely naive. I think we should credit everyone involved with being idealistic and generous and committed to positive change, but also own up to the fact that that was naive in a number of different ways. I think if you look at a successful lecture course at any campus, it involves a lot more than the lecture, and many of those other parts are important. We don't really know how to scale those in the same way. So it's clear that there's a tremendous need, several orders of magnitude, larger demand than supply. Simple methods that are technology only don't seem to be effective. In my mind, it's largely a pedagogy and learning model problem, not a technology problem. The technology involved is easy to build and straightforward. We just don't know how to use that effectively. And finally, I don't see that we're going to get to scale in a uniform, top-down, here's the method sort of way. The need for learning is as diverse as there are walks of life. And so there are many different kinds of organizations, institutions, individuals who can contribute. It may be that in the future, colleges and universities and structured educational programs are going to be central and key, but it may be that there are going to be other ways. If you think of all the things you want to learn over the course of your lifetime, how many of them have to come from a structured educational program? So I see scale as coming about through recognition of tremendous demand, through use of a variety of tools, through increasing pedagogical sophistication and increasingly effective learning science. And the business model and the financing is just tough. So I'll leave you the last 90 seconds here.
Okay.
So you'll help us there.
Two things. If you go to any community, any inner city, any rural area, anywhere in the world, everybody knows where the good school is or the good university, and there's always at least one. And if you walk into that, you will find three things. You'll find an enlightened leader. You'll find an expectation that every child, every student, every person in that organization has the capacity to learn. And you'll find that the culture of learning starts with the leadership and the teaching faculty. And there's a willingness to learn from and share and engage with each other. And I think that's what, to scale, that's what we need to bring to private sector organizations, to universities around the world, to government organizations. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, I'd say that we are just in the foothills of what this industry and this sector is capable of doing. So far, the most scalable solutions, for example, in higher education, have really been about automating the setting and marking of homework and providing some fairly basic personalization and adaptive learning. We are now combining the learning sciences, the cognitive sciences, machine learning, all the data that we've collected over the last decade or so about how people learn, capable of doing something much more exciting, much more challenging, and that's around this whole idea of authentic assessment, which really does break out the privilege of that liberal arts education and make it scalable and shareable for everybody. That's the truly disruptive thing that we can do now, and none of us can do that in our own. We'll do it by co-creating, co-developing, working together, and that's, I think, is the most exciting thing we can all be working on.
Well, thank you for your contributions today and more generally as leaders in the field. I think our time is up. It's been a pleasure and hopefully of value to everyone here.